inglés.
Ok. Estamos dichosas y felices en Hypatia de estar en este momento con Riane Eisler desde Carmel, en California, en Estados Unidos. Es un honor estar contigo, Riane. Bienvenida, ¿cómo estás?
Gracias. Bueno, estoy muy feliz de estar contigo, pero creo que en un ratito vamos a hablar en inglés, ¿verdad?
Sí, vamos a hablar lo que tú quieras en español y lo que tú quieras en inglés. Para eso tenemos subtítulos. Así que vamos a iniciar nuestra entrevista a una de las pioneras del cambio más relevantes de del siglo pasado y influyentes en este siglo, en los cambios que estamos viviendo en este momento. Riane, lo primero que quiero preguntarte es cuáles han sido tus reflexiones más importantes durante el periodo de cuarentena.
Bueno, yo también estoy muy feliz de estar contigo y quiero decir que yo quisiera hablar en español, pero mi español es un español de una niña con un vocabulario muy, muy pequeño. Pero voy a tratar de decir que mi reflexión en este tiempo es que es un tiempo de crisis, pero también es un tiempo de oportunidad de hacer lo que nos aconsejó Einstein, porque él nos dijo que no podemos resolver problemas con la misma forma de pensar que los creo. Y mi trabajo está fuera de la paradigma, ¿se dice paradigma?
Sí.
Convencional. And I will switch to English. The COVID-19 crisis, especially here in the United States, has really shown the structural flaws of the current systems, economic systems, political systems, family systems. And it has also shown the importance of the work that I wrote a whole book about called La verdadera riqueza de las naciones, the real wealth of nations, the work of caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for our Mother Earth. So this is an opportunity for us to not only change our own thinking, but to help change the worldview around us. And once we become conscious that what we're trying to leave behind is what I've called a domination system, and that we've been trying to move towards what I've called a partnership system, and that this is possible, then we can really move forward and use this time to change a lot of what we have inherited from earlier, more domination-oriented times, really starting with where we all live, our family, childhood, gender, and other intimate relations. Because unlike conventional categories, the domination system and the partnership system don't just erase or ignore the importance of these relations. These new categories show the connection between a rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian, and highly punitive family and a repressive, authoritarian, force and fear-based national regime, and an unjust economy, where basically what I call domination economics is the norm.
Sí, en ese sentido, Riane, estamos viviendo un momento extraordinario en el que estamos todos en casa y tenemos la experiencia de volver a lo simple, ¿no? De volver a vernos a nosotros mismos en las tareas del cuidado de los niños, del cuidado del jardín o de la naturaleza, del cuidado de las personas, del cuidado de nuestros enfermos. Estamos todos confinados para proteger a los que se pueden enfermar. Es algo muy inédito en la historia de la humanidad, estar guardados para cuidar que algunas personas no mueran. En ese sentido, y además están ocurriendo cosas extraordinarias, como las reivindicaciones femeninas, lo que está pasando en Nueva Zelanda también, cambiar los índices de desarrollo. En ese sentido, ¿cuál ha sido tu experiencia de esta cuarentena, de estar no sé cuánto tiempo? Acá llevamos 4 meses, no sé cuánto tiempo llevan allá en Carmel, en los cambios que estamos viviendo. ¿Hay esperanza en ti con respecto a este tiempo de cambio de paradigma mental y de hábitos en las personas?
Well, tú sabes que Gandhi dijo que no debemos de confundir lo es habitual con lo que es normal. And I will now switch to English. Gandhi said that we shouldn't confuse what is habitual for what is normal and for what is possible. And for us, I think this can be a time of reflection on why have present systems failed and what do we need to do so that we can build a really more equitable and sustainable future for ourselves, our children, and generations to come. Because that's the big work ahead of us. Now, my work has been to provide some of the building blocks for this tremendous enterprise of not only deconstructing or protesting, but of reconstructing. And I have introduced not only a new way of looking at society and various aspects of society, but also focused on the need to shift 4 cornerstones that are usually ignored. Mm-hmm. The so-called progressive social agenda. And we have to shift them from domination to partnership. One is childhood. One is gender. That's the second one. The third is economics, but going beyond both capitalism and socialism. And the fourth, and they're all interconnected, is language and narratives. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then politics, everything will follow from those. And I've also worked on developing tools. For example, what I call social wealth economic indicators, which are very different from the conventional indicators of economic health, like GDP or GNP. And they're also different from the so-called GDP alternatives, which focus primarily on human well-being, but don't focus on what we have to do so that really we can develop our unique human capacities, a capacity for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, which are the capacities that are most developed in our species. And that, to do that, we really have to take into account what we know, first of all, from neuroscience. And my newest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which just came out last year with Oxford University Press, and the subtitle is How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. Really contains the evidence verifying what my theory of the partnership domination scale brings to fore, that we can no longer ignore in analyzing where we are, where we've been, and where we can go, the foundational human relations of childhood and gender roles and relations. So we really have to start with the basics. And I want to say that actually this should be very, very evident to us, because whether it was Hitler in Germany, whether it was Khomeini in Iran, whether it's the Taliban, ISIS, the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance, all of these seemingly very different, right? Eastern, Western, capitalist, socialist, secular, religious, they have had as a primary goal to push us back to a rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian, highly punitive family where children learn two basic lessons before their brains are fully formed, much less their critical faculties. They learn, first of all, that they have to obey orders no matter how unjust, or there will be a lot of pain. And children are dependent for life. So this is a lesson that children internalize. And the other thing that they learn, and the two are really related, is a model of humanity in which the female and male forms, there are two basic forms of humanity, the male form and the female form, in which they learn that the male form is superior to the female form. The male form should dominate. The male form should be served by the female form. In other words, they learn in-group versus out-group thinking, starting with the in-group of, quote, mankind and the female other. And then they have this template for all differences, whether it's based on race, on religion, on ethnicity, whether it's Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East, or white versus black in the United States. It doesn't really matter. They have this in their brains and they apply it. And this is a form of scapegoating, of denial, that attributes danger and evil to the out group, starting with Eve, right? After all, Eve or Pandora, they're to blame for everything, aren't they?
Yes.
And so you don't have to recognize that it's actually the pain that you are suffering and that you have suffered, the fear, has been built into the kind of family system that you've grown up in. So to ignore that, progressives will continually be faced with regressions to domination, continually. Whether it was Hitler in Germany, Stalin in the former Soviet Union, Khomeini in Iran, Taliban, ISIS, the rightist fundamentalist alliance, that is the kind of family that for them is a top priority. And so progressives have a lot to learn. We must change these two cornerstones, childhood and gender. And once we do, and we can get to that in a moment, we can also then understand what's really wrong with our economic systems and with our stories and language, and change those two.
Ok, entonces vamos a hablar de cómo cambiar la economía, que ha sido también un tema muy importante que tú has instalado, ¿no? En La verdadera riqueza de las naciones, en tu libro que publicaste en el 2007, donde defines que la verdadera economía y fortaleza de nuestra sociedad se sustenta en el trabajo de cuidado invisible y no remunerado que hacen especialmente las mujeres y que no está representado en los indicadores de desarrollo que definen el desarrollo de la humanidad, ¿no? Y entonces, ¿cuáles serían estos nuevos indicadores de riqueza social que debiéramos incorporar todas las naciones que nos facilitaran llevar a un auténtico desarrollo equitativo, equilibrado?
Well, the first step really is to take a look first at GDP and GNP, which are the ones that are most relied on as so-called measures of economic health. Now, these measures, if we really look at them, actually include activities that harm and take life. Making cigarettes, the resulting medical costs, the resulting funeral costs, they're all great for GDP. They're all considered productive. Same is true of oil spills, the cleanup costs, the lawsuits, productive. Fast foods and all of the health and mortality costs, productive. But not only do these indicators of so-called economic health include negatives as positives, they fail to include as productive work the work of caring for people and for nature. Starting with people in early childhood and going on throughout life. So the social wealth economic indicators that the Center for Partnership Studies launched in 2014 are an attempt to go not only beyond GDP and GNP, but also beyond the so-called GDP alternatives that focus on well-being. Well-being can be defined in many, many ways, and sometimes a slave will say that they're happy, right? So, and women have been taught certain roles and men have been taught certain roles. Women in many nations have been taught to be happy if a man beats them because that's how he shows his love, right? I mean, it's crazy, but that's the reality. These really measure two things. One is the state of human capacity development as measured by how many children have access, how many families have access to high quality early childhood education, because we know that if we're talking about human development, that's fundamental. What nations have paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers? What percentage of the GDP is invested in family support? What percentage of GDP is invested in caring for nature? And really showing that the lack of human capacity development and the lack of care for nature are directly related to what I've called a gendered system of values that both capitalism and socialism carry forward. Because for both Marx and for Smith, the work of caring for people, caring for children, caring for the sick, that was just reproductive women's work to be performed in a male-controlled household for free. So it wasn't even part of economics. And so I've suggested that we really have to have a completely different way of looking at what is wealth. And I define wealth once our basic material needs are met, our real wealth consists of the contributions of people and of nature. And therefore, we need to invest in caring for people and for nature. And that's something that the COVID epidemic really has brought out, hasn't it? So we can start with the reality rather than some fantasies of what is economically productive. And now we're working on an index, one number, consolidating 24 social wealth economic indicators into one number that will be easily accessible. And we'd like to have this indicator be used by nations, and what nations that invest more in their human capacity have done much better than nations that don't, in terms of all of the things, even the material things that we consider development.
Riane, ¿dónde podemos leer estos indicadores, esta lista de indicadores de la riqueza social?
We have them on our website, which is centerforpartnership.org. Centerforpartnership.org. And you can look at the section on social wealth economic indicators and also social wealth index. And you can find out about them. And we're in the process now of not only developing the social wealth index, but there's also a group of leaders, and I want to invite you, as well as the viewers of this interview, to be part of a group that is working to change how we think about both economics, society, gender, of course, childhood, race, religion. I mean, the problem isn't really that racism is built into domination systems, just as this, because it's part of this in-group versus out-group thinking, starting, as I said, with the male form somehow being considered superior to the female form. They're all interconnected. And that we're beginning to talk about intersectionality is very important, but it's not enough. We really need a completely different way of looking at social systems rather than right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, and so forth.
Otro tema muy interesante que hemos vivido también durante esta cuarentena es que hemos podido presenciar como una presidenta, una primera ministra mujer, como es Jacinda Ardern en Nueva Zelanda, ya declaró que los indicadores de desarrollo para su nación están obsoletos y se lanzan al desafío de crear nuevos indicadores para el desarrollo. Entonces estamos viendo que los cambios se empiezan a concretar. No solamente son ideas de lo que es posible, sino que hay personas implementando los cambios realmente. ¿Qué te parece esta iniciativa de Nueva Zelanda?
Bueno, eso es muy importante. Es una mujer, pero hay mujeres como Margaret Thatcher, por ejemplo, que para subir en sistemas de dominación han identificado con machismo, masculinidad, toughness, violence, like, the war, I mean, crazy, so this is not an issue of women against men or men against women. This is getting rid of the rigid gender stereotypes so that we can free human capacity, human potential in both women and men. And now getting to New Zealand and to the fact, it is not coincidental that women are in the leadership of understanding the obvious, that we've been working with social categories and economic categories, and hence economic measures that are totally unrealistic because they do not take into account the most important human work of caring for people starting very early at birth and even before, and caring for nature. And to shift that requires a change in consciousness. Once we change our consciousness, we then can have really focused and successful action. And once we use this action to make some changes, nobody can do everything. Then our consciousness of what is possible changes even more. And that is where this new frame of the partnership domination social scale is so empowering, really. And it's also why we really need to stop arguing about capitalism and socialism. They both came out of more rigid domination times. They actually both came out of the 1700s and 1800s, very early industrial times, and we're now in the 21st century post-industrial age. So on that count alone, they would be antiquated. But it's the domination luggage that they carry and perpetuate. And we can change this. Social systems, economic systems are human creations. We can create better ones.
Así es. Y también, Riane, me gustaría que comentaras, porque hay personas que no creen en la capacidad del ser humano de vivir en paz, de vivir en armonía, en belleza, rodeado de arte, rodeado de equilibrio. Y tú hiciste en el libro El cáliz y la espada, este maravilloso libro que ha sido traducido a 22 idiomas, explicas cómo nosotros hemos sido capaces de vivir en distintas épocas, en la Europa antigua, en distintas comunidades, en perfecto equilibrio, armonía, paz, y que esto se sustenta en la equidad de género. Y a veces también en liderazgo femenino, matrilineal, pero básicamente en sociedades igualitarias. ¿Nos puedes contar en qué épocas esto fue posible y cuáles son los principios que sostienen a estas comunidades?
Bueno, aquí empezamos con idioma, porque nuestro idioma nos da solamente dos posibilidades para una categoría social que el foco es género. The only two categories we are given are matriarchy or patriarchy. But really, matriarchy and patriarchy are two sides of a domination coin, aren't they? Either mothers dominate or fathers dominate. And that is not the alternative. So what we see, and I'm digressing a little, but I'll get back to what you asked me to about the evidence of earlier, more partnership-oriented societies, and even contemporary ones, by the way. The real alternative is not a matriarchy. The real alternative is what we actually see in the evidence, which is a more partnership-oriented society. Not sameness necessarily, but where women, and with this, if women are valued, then social and economic priorities that are considered, quote, soft or feminine, like caring for people, caring for nature, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which translates into our planet, of course, taking care of children, which we know today from neuroscience is fundamental to what kind of world they think is normal. All of this begins to then fall into place. So what is the evidence? And by the way, the Chalice and the Blade is now in its, I think it's its 57th US printing, and in 26 foreign editions, I think it is. So it's still going strong, and it's more relevant today than ever before. That's one of the lovely things about my books. They really are relevant and more relevant every day. So what is the evidence? First of all, these societies, for example, Catalogado, which was an very early farming horticultural society, there are no signs of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years. Secondly, there are signs of gender equity. The grave goods, the evidence, the Ian Hodder wrote that there's really no evidence here that being born male or female made much difference in one's status in life. It's very important, isn't it? And very different. And of course, they were more generally egalitarian. We see this in the size of houses, in the grave goods, but we also see it very much in the art. And if you look at, I teach a course through the Center for Partnership Studies called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. And you can find out about it. There are 4 videos that go with it that you can watch. And there are, some curricular materials that go with it. But if you look at the art, you see something extraordinary. You see a massive shift from art that celebrates life and life-giving to art that celebrates force, fear, life-taking, rape, themes that are absolutely absent from the earlier art. And in my newest book, in Nurturing Our Humanity, I've been working on this for 10 years because I was so fascinated by how the evidence from neuroscience really supports the thesis that empathy was, actually wired into our brains. And you know that our brains light up, the pleasure centers in our brains light up more when we share and care than when we win.
Yes.
This is knowledge that people need to have. We've been told original sin stories, selfish gene stories, they're false. Yes, we're capable of cruelty, of insensitivity, of violence, but given half a chance, that's the key. Given a social and familial and religious and economic and educational and political system that rewards not cruelty, not domination, not violence, we will choose that. We will choose that. We're wired for it. But in Nurturing Our Humanity, not only do we present evidence for this, but about 3 years ago, 3 years before the book was published, I invited anthropologist Douglas Fry to be my co-author because he is one of the world's experts on foraging societies, gathering hunting societies, which is how we lived for millennia, for millions of years. And he calls them the original partnership societies. So really, what we have here is about a 5,000 to 10,000 year old domination detour from the original direction of human civilization. And if we look, and I really want to have you think that way, if we look at the last 300 years, one progressive movement after another has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. Whether it was the Enlightenment, 1700s, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule, they're called subjects, whether the feminist movement challenging, again, the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in their homes, and they were confined to their homes. Whether it was the challenge to, again, the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over an inferior so-called race, the abolitionist, civil rights, anti-colonial movements, all the way to the movements for social and economic justice challenging top-down domination, to the environmental movement challenging yet another tradition of domination, our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature. So we don't have to start from square one, but we do have to understand that we're all part of those of us who think of ourselves as wanting to move to a better world, who recognize that that has been really what we humans need and want. We don't have to start from square one. We can, but we have to focus on those four cornerstones, changing them: childhood, gender, caring economics, and language, because, and narratives, but language, linguistic psychologists tell us that the categories provided by a language really channel our thinking, so that it's almost impossible to see other possibilities. So that is why I am so passionate about this work.
No, es increíble el trabajo. Y me gustaría que profundizáramos sobre el cuarto punto, que son las narrativas. Sabemos también por las neurociencias y las comunidades indígenas, por ejemplo, aquí en Chile, como la mapuche, que hablan sobre la importancia de las narrativas y cómo la palabra crea realidad. ¿Cuáles son las narrativas que tenemos que eliminar o que tenemos que estar conscientes y cambiarlas? ¿Por qué narrativas? Sabemos que las narrativas positivas generan mucho bienestar en el sistema biológico, en la felicidad, en el sistema psicológico, pero tenemos narrativas, por ejemplo, para resolver el tema de COVID, hablamos o del cáncer, que tenemos que luchar contra el cáncer, que tenemos que... usamos las narrativas de la guerra. ¿Cuáles son las narrativas en las que tenemos que abrazar para crear esta nueva realidad?
Well, you know, I think this is where our capacity for creativity really comes in. We humans don't just adapt. We don't just respond. We actually create. We've created a whole niche called human culture, both material and immaterial culture. I can tell you, we can start with little things. Like, for example, there's a saying about killing two birds with one stone, right? Well, why not hatch two birds from one egg? That may life supporting. I mean, these are little things, and they may seem little, but they're not. They're fundamental. Because if everything is us against them, I mean, our president, who is completely messed up in the United States, he said it's all about domination. That's his narrative. That's what he believes. So we have to say no. And we really also, I would suggest that one of the important places to start, because of what we know from neuroscience about how very flexible the human brain is, especially when we're children, are our fairy tales. Because consider that our fairy tales not only idealize kings and queens and nobles, right, as against the, quote, common people, but they present such rigid gender stereotypes. I mean, Sleeping Beauty, she can't even wake up without a man giving her a kiss. Cinderella, forget it. I mean, you know, I mean, all she fitting into Prince Charming's slipper is her big aim in life. That is a symptom of power imbalances. And teaching children these stories, probably in a rigid domination system, prepared them to fit into rigid systems. I mean, for example, St. Augustine, very revered, he said about social mobility, he said, for anyone to even consider changing their station in life, even thinking about this, it's like a nose wanting to be an eye. And you know, these are the stories that resonate, but we've changed some of these stories. Now we need to change them even more. We know what is really successful parenting, and we know that even the American Psychological Association finally came out and said spanking children is not only ineffective, because they become very rebellious and they become, quote, bad children, but it is harmful to their development. Well, yeah, but it is fundamental to domination systems. Gender, very fundamental. Very fundamental. It isn't just a women's issue. But we've been taught, look, out of about 600 years of so-called modern Western science, only in 50 years ago did we even begin to have women's studies, and then men's studies, and then queer studies, and they're still completely marginalized rather than being woven into the curriculum. And as for child development, it's the same thing. It's maybe in a course on psychology or neuroscience here. It should be part of sociology, of psychology, political science, economics. So we have a lot of stories to change. And nobody can do everything. None of us can do everything, but every one of us can do something. Start where you are. Start with where your sphere of influence, no matter how small it may be. Start speaking the language of partnership rather than domination. And start spreading the term partnerism, because we need a completely different ism rather than capitalism or socialism or whatever. So we can all be part of this wonderful enterprise of building a more equitable, sustainable, and caring future.
Ok, Riane, gracias. Muy bella síntesis la que acabas de decir. Y para terminar, una última pregunta. Estamos presenciando revoluciones feministas sobre inclusión, sobre diversidad de género, sobre diversidad de identidad también en las personas. La gente joven de 15, 18, 20 años realmente están utilizando nuevos lenguajes, nuevas formas de identificarse, nuevas formas de no aceptar la discriminación desde lo más privado, desde su identidad sexual hasta en lo público como activistas, en las marchas, en las manifestaciones. Tienen un nivel de conciencia muy nuevo, muy interesante. ¿Qué mensaje me gustaría unirlas a ellas, que representan tanto de los temas que tú has impulsado contigo, y que les dijeras un mensaje para estas nuevas generaciones, especialmente mujeres que están en las calles creando, haciendo activismo y creando nuevas narrativas, nuevas formas de identidad? ¿Qué te gustaría decirles?
Well, first I want to congratulate them because they're beginning to wake up from what I call the domination trance. And we are all taught to be, I was really, my background is not only as a system scientist and a social scientist and a cultural historian, but also as an attorney. And I still remember that one day the senior partner called me into his office to quote, compliment me on some work I had done. And he said, oh, that was just great. You don't think like a woman. And I, not only he, thought it was a compliment rather than the insult that it really was. So I think we have moved. But what we have to really think about is the whole system. And I'm a feminist. I mean, I founded the first women's center on the west coast of the United States. I founded the first center on women and the law. I wrote the book on the Equal Rights Amendment that was a mass paperback. But I think that we have to really broaden our lens, and that's beginning to happen. Because what we have to, first of all, get rid of the gender stereotypes. And that means male as well as female. And yes, it also means recognizing what we know, that a certain percentage of the population has a fluid gender identity, and that a certain percentage of the population is born really to be gay, to be lesbian, and that's just how it is. But it goes way beyond these things. It means connecting the dots between these four cornerstones. And so I say to these young people, and I say people because a lot of young men are also today beginning to wake up from the domination trance. Not all of them. And there's a very wonderful men's movement going on, which is really important as well. But I say to them, connect the dots and help others connect the dots. And yes, keep doing your work on changing gender stereotypes, but understand the gender system of values that underlies our economic malfunctions, and connect those dots and change the reward system, the measurement system for economics, change economic metrics, join us in doing that, change economic policies, join us in getting people to think differently, and think about the narratives and the stories, and you're already doing a lot of that. But help everybody that you come into contact with to really shift to this way of looking at the world and of changing the world that is a unified frame for change, so that we aren't just fighting against each other, because that has been one of the great tragedies of progressive movements. And as I said, we come by it honestly because so-called educated people who have so-called higher education really have been taught that gender childhood are not important things. They're not really the important things. And I know when I first started to wake up, I realized that in all my years of higher education, hardly anything had been about, by, or for people like me, women. That was amazing. I mean, that was a big aha.
Mm-hmm.
But it's part of the domination system. So we can change it, as I said. And you who are young and are on the forefront, join the partnerism movement. We're having a group now formed of communications to really spread this. So if you're interested in this, get in touch and we'll put you in touch with the people who are heading it.
Ok, Riane, muchísimas gracias. Ha sido un placer escucharte. Siempre poder ver tu visión tan amplia, tan trascendente, muy a largo plazo. Conversar contigo siempre es como estar viendo a 100 años, a 500 años hacia atrás y hacia adelante. Y espero que estemos muy conectadas, sigamos trabajando juntas en colaboración, y mucha suerte, mucha salud para este tiempo, y muchas gracias por tus palabras.
Y muchas gracias, Aleka, y keep up your very, very important work. Thank you.
Chao, chao, Riane.